This past week, legendary Disney designer Rolly Crump passed away. He started his career in 1952 as an animator, but by the end of the 1950s, he was working at WED. He helped design It's a Small World, The Tiki Room, and The Haunted Mansion, to name a few. In the 1950s and 1960s, WED was largely occupied by middle-aged background and layout artists transferred over from animation and by live-action set designers hired away from 20th Century Fox and MGM. Rolly was an outlier. He was younger than most of the artists at WED. He was a beatnik, and he was never afraid to rebel from social norms. He walked to the beat of his own drum, and Walt Disney liked that about him. This past Monday, after I found out he passed, I went through my hard drive looking for interviews that I had recorded with him some 16 years ago, where we discussed his entire career over many hours. So today on the podcast, I have some of those stories as a way of honoring his work and his life. If you've ever wondered what it would be like to work with Walt as he shifted his focus from animation over to his beloved Disneyland, here is one designer's memories and stories of exactly how that transpired. This is the story of who Rolly was and what he accomplished. Also, I've trimmed some of the saltier PG-13 language, but there are a few places in today's podcast where there's still mild profanity. I mention this for anyone listening with kids, but other than that, get ready for some fabulous stories of what it was like to work both at the studio and then later at WED during the time of Walt. And to begin this episode, I would like to bring in the voice of Rolly to explain what is most important about his stories.
Well, the thing I love about my stories is they're all true.
And so, if you're ready, here is our tribute to the legendary Rolly Crump. Unlike previous generations of Disney animators, men and women who wanted to be anything else, commercial artists or gallery painters, and then happened into animation, Rolly was among that first generation who grew up dreaming about what it would be like to be an animator, to work for a studio like Disney. Rolly arrived at Disney in 1952 as the studio was finishing up work on Peter Pan. He was an in-betweener, which is an entry-level animator. At this time, Disney trained young artists in groups. Rolly worked in a bullpen with other in-betweeners where he learned the techniques of animation. For any given scene, a lead animator would animate out the beginning, the end, and other key moments. They would also animate any drawings that were held on screen for longer than a couple of frames of film. These were viewed as the most important drawings, and therefore needed to be completed by the highest skilled animator. If a scene required 60 individual drawings, the lead might animate 15 of them, some at the beginning, some in the middle, and some at the end, with large gaps. This lead would then hand the scene off to a hand-selected assistant animator who would fill in some of those gaps, adding perhaps another 15 drawings until the arc of motion was fully laid out, with only small breaks that needed to still be filled in with fresh drawings. By this point, at least half or maybe even the majority of the scene was finished, but to smooth out and finish the action, one final set of drawings needed to be placed in between the drawings that presently existed. For this, the assistant animator handed the scene off to an in-betweener whose job it was to create drawings whose movements are in between those already finished on paper. More advanced in-betweeners tended to work in animation units, but new in-betweeners worked in a group, typically at the end of an animation hall, in what was casually called the bullpen.
I was the last in-betweener hired on Peter Pan. I was in a bullpen.
Where were the bullpens in the?
Well, they were always it was like the first room in all the wings. It was like D1, or E1, or I was an A1, and there was 5 of us in that bullpen, and it was great. It was wild because everybody was doing all kinds of stuff. We used to make darts and have dart, and we'd have rubber band fights because the great big rubber bands on the animation scenes and stuff. So it was marvelous because it was crazy, and Walt allowed it.
And you started in on Peter Pan, or did you start doing some of the shorts? Or
no. Well, I did shorts and Peter Pan.
Shorts and Peter Pan.
Yeah. In fact, you were supposed to do 30 ducks a day, 30 in-betweens a day. But if it was a feature, then you did Peter Pan. He was worth 10 ducks. I mean, at the end of the day, you were supposed to have done 30 drawings, or the equivalent to that as far as feature animation goes, which was bullshit. They didn't do anything to us about it, but it was a very educational time frame. It was great.
Like other in-betweeners, he embraced studio culture. He fell into art circles. He learned the fundamentals of animation. Though older artists pitched in to finish Disneyland in July 1955, Rolly remained at the studio. But like all studio employees, he did receive passes to Press Preview Day on Sunday, July 17th. It was the employee's job while in the park on that day to make sure that Disneyland was filled with enthusiastic smiles, particularly when they were standing right in front of the cameras. He saw the parade, he went on the steamboat, he took some 8mm home movies. But Rolly soon discovered that Press Preview Day didn't turn out exactly as he had imagined.
It was crowded. I had a pickup truck, and I took 2 other couples with me in the back of the truck on a mattress. And we went down there, took my wife and my daughter, and went down there. And it was so crowded you couldn't see anything. I know I took an 8mm of Debbie Reynolds and Eddie Fisher going by in a carriage, and it's over the top of a bald-headed guy. And I'm also in the Mark Twain, shooting the people as I leave the dock, and it's, you can imagine what an 8mm film would be like in the opening day,
Wow.
But you couldn't go on any of the rides. I mean, it was packed.
For the in-betweeners, especially those in a bullpen, they often longed to find a promotion that would elevate them up into a regular unit, where typically a lead animator would train them in the finer points of character drawing and animation.
How long was it before you got pulled out of the bullpen and got attached to?
Well, basically, I don't remember exactly how they assigned you from one thing to another. They just moved you around depending on probably the person that wanted to have you work for them. And I never paid much attention to that. Or like for example, I was in a room with Walt Stanchfield, and this was on Sleeping Beauty. And I think for some reason Walt asked for me to work with him. So you were asked by somebody that's where you went to a bullpen, or they would just sprinkle us around like salt and pepper, which was crazy. I was in one room with Walt Paragoy and Dale Barnhart, right next to the men's room in the D wing, and I don't know how we all ended up together. So there was a lot of times I don't think there was any real structure to it, but then there were times that there was. I know that Eric Larson did ask for me to be his assistant after he came back from vacation after Sleeping Beauty, because then he was back into animation again.
The first feature that Rolly worked on with Eric Larson was 101 Dalmatians. Larson was an expert at analyzing the structure of a character, understanding how it would move, how its bones and muscles provided a realistic flow for its actions. And this was a complex process, managing both a realistic image and believable movement. At this point, Larson had been an animator for 27 years. Rolly had been an animator for just 8. Though Rolly and Eric Larson worked on the same scenes, they focused on different parts of each drawing. Eric was the lead animator, and Rolly was the hand-selected assistant.
They named one of the little puppies Rolly.
That's
And
right.
I don't know whether that's supposed to be me or not, because I did have the name. But working with Eric, I ended up doing all the spots on the puppies in one sequence. So all I did was spots for 6 months on the little puppies, which was kind of fun. So
There'd be a lot of spots. On the
yeah,
puppies.
a lot of spots.
Now that Rolly had a little job security, he started to become part of studio gag culture. Animators were always playing practical jokes on each other, hopeful not to get caught. One of their favorite targets was lead animator Milt Kahl. Kahl was arguably the most gifted draftsman at the studio in the 1950s and 1960s, also one of the 2 or 3 best animators in terms of character movement. He also had a stern personality and was prone to outbursts. These things together made him a common target for pranks that Rolly loved.
Oh yeah. I was there the night Evo was drilling the hole in the wall.
Oh, Iwo was drilling the hole.
It was there was John Freeman and Iwo Takamoto. They were Freeman was his assistant, and so was Iwo. And one night on overtime, I came in and Iwo was on the floor drilling a hole in the wall. And so I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, we're drilling a hole in the wall. What are you going to do with it?" And they said, "Well, we've got it lined up with his crotch, because in the animation building, the animation table or desk has a hole for the cord to go through that lights the lamp, for the disc, and they had lined that up perfectly." And so I said, "What are you going to do?" And they said, "Well, we're going to shoot him in the crotch with talcum powder." And I said, "You're doing what?" He said, "Oh yeah." And so they did. They actually got this big ball, and they showed it to me, filled it with talcum powder, and go through, poof, and he would never hear it, because he's in there working and everything, and he'd get up and there'd be talcum powder all over him, and they said that he was really funny. He started yelling, saying, "Where did this talcum powder come from? Where did all this?" And so they did that for a couple of weeks, and then one weekend they collected flies, and they had a funnel that went into his room. And they had jars of flies, and they kept tapping on the jars because it was an air-conditioned building. And all of a sudden, his whole room was filled with these goddamn flies, and Milt was just going crazy with these flies, And finally, the coup de grace was he was going to have lunch with Walt. So he came in, he had a sport coat on and everything, and he flipped the switch to turn off his lamp for his disc, and they let him have it right in the crotch with hot water. And that pretty much ended the gag. So he had to go out and meet Walt with a wet crotch. But you see, that's and I saw these things. I saw these things take place.
At around this same time, Rolly became interested in the art school culture that existed in the studio. In the center of the animation building was a research library. Animators also used this library space to display their personal art, paintings or sculpture or line drawings. As you might have guessed by now, Rolly had some wildness in him, something that couldn't easily be contained. When he displayed his personal art, he chose 2 mediums. Part of his display was experimental mobile art, intricate structures arranged with movement that hung from the ceiling. In our interview, Rolly refers to these mobiles as propeller art, and the other part of his display was a set of joke posters filled with the anti-establishment graphic art style of the early 1960s. These were beatnik posters with joke advertisements, many of them advertising drugs. During this period, Rolly made one poster that advertised marijuana, which, and here I'll quote the poster, has that truly fine, narcotic aroma imported by Stoned and Company. Another poster advises to fly heroin airlines, go the way of least resistance. Rolly also made at least a few posters for parody businesses that might have been more acceptable inside the studio, such as the Dingaling Brothers Circus, who flew under the slogan, "Never before such a large amount of junk under one tent." But these were the types of posters that Rolly displayed in the center of the Disney Animation Building, right beside his whimsical, inventive mobiles. At Disney, there were a number of paths that led to advancement. Assistant animators, if they were gifted painters, might move from animation to the backgrounds department. Assistant animators, if they were gifted in arranging movement with strong drawings, might eventually become full animators. And assistant animators, if Walt liked them, and if he felt that they had unique skills, might be transferred over to his private company, WED. But it was also difficult to transfer up out of the role of assistant animator at all, because that lead animator, once they've trained a good assistant, typically didn't want to start over and train someone else. And I should also point out here that the Ward that Rolly mentions in this segment is Disney legend animator Ward Kimball.
What happened was, Walt kept saying, we got to get more guys to WED. We got to get more, because he wanted to reach in his own animation department, pull them out, put them there, because he trusted the guys that worked for him. And he knew that if they understood him, they, not, instead of bringing designers from the outside and try to train them, the Disney way, it wouldn't work. So he had a meeting one time, and Ward was in it, and Ward says, well, what about Rolly Crump? He says, who's Rolly Crump? And he says, well, he's the guy that does these propellers. And so he says, oh, he does? And they said to him, yeah, by the way, he has an exhibit in the library of his propellers. You should go see it. Well, he went and saw it. He also saw my dope posters, which was kind of a crack up, because Keita, that ran the library, called me and says, Rolly, Walt was here today. I said, oh, shit, did he go down the hall and see the posters? And she said, oh, yeah. And I said, oh, my God, he saw those. And I said, what did he say? She said, he laughed. Now, you had to understand the man was incredible. Mm-hmm. He accepted everything, as long as it was in decent, good taste or whatever. So then he went to management and said, we'd like to have Rolly join us at WET. So he and Ken Peterson, they worked together, contacted Eric Larson and said, they'd like to have Rolly go, to WED. Well, at that time, WED was called Cannibal Island, because once you went to WED, you never came back. It's one of those things. And so Eric told him, no, he said, he's too important in animation to be let go. No, he can't go over there. Because they never asked me. Mm-hmm. So they told Walt that I was too important in animation. So then I guess a couple of months went by or something, and finally Walt said something about, we got to get some people over here. And Ward says, what happened to Rolly Crump? He says, oh, he's too important. And Ward says, no, he's not. He says, I think he would prefer working at WED. Well, now Eric Larson's on vacation in Europe. Mm-hmm. And then they came in and they said, Rolly, would you like to work at WED? And I said, when can I start? And they said, Monday. And I said, I'll take it. And that was it. And then he got another real sweet guy to be his assistant, so there was no problem.
Mm-hmm. And this was what Rolly wanted. The type of whimsical mobiles he'd made for his gallery show in the animation building were far more in line with the type of design and model work being done at WED.
But I was aware of WED. I'd already been hanging out in the model shop, so it was an interesting time frame, but it was a quick transition, but it was the propellers.
In the 1950s and 1960s, WED was Walt's personal playground. The people there created attractions for Disneyland. They also created attractions for outside venues, such as the New York World's Fair. Once over at WED, Rolly was in many group meetings with Walt, but for months, Walt couldn't remember his name.
When I met Walt, he says, Roland, it's a pleasure to have you join us. This is when I went to work at WED. And I said, thank you, Mr. Disney. He says, no. He says, the name is Walt, and don't you forget it. I says, okay. So I was Roland for quite a while. And then probably 6 months later, there was a writer that wrote a lot of the scripts for the films. His name was Owen Crump. So all of a sudden I became Owen. So he started calling me Owen, and I went along with anything he called me. And then eventually Owen turned into Orland. So I was Orland for a while. But the coup de grace was I was in a meeting with him with Gail Gracie, and Walt turned over and he says, Yale, I want you and what's his name here to work on it. So I was what's his name for a couple of meetings, and then finally I became Rolly, which is a nickname he gave me,
At first, Rolly didn't have a primary assignment at WED. At this time, WED was still located on the first floor of the animation building right there at the Burbank studio. Rolly simply worked on projects where he was needed.
Well, when they transferred me to WED inside the studio, they didn't know what to do with me, which was really funny. They said, well, we hired you, Rolly, but, we're going to do some puppets. Would you mind carving the hands out of balsa wood? And I said, no, I'll do whatever you want. So I was going to carve hands for some puppets that they were doing. And then Claude Coates was doing a ride, which was the
Oz.
The Wizard Oz ride. And so Claude said, Rolly, in the Oz ride, we're going to have this big field. He says, I want them all to be propellers. He says, I want a field of propellers. And I said, okay. So that was what I was going to do, was that.
Here, Rolly is talking about a never-built attraction that featured the characters from Oz. Though MGM owned the movie rights to the book, The Wizard of Oz, this was just one of 14 books set in the world of Oz. Walt was also interested in the Oz stories. In the early 50s, he purchased the rights to 11 of the Oz books. 3 years later, he acquired the rights to a 12th book. Initially, Walt considered developing an Oz story for his weekly TV show, something in 2 parts that might be released overseas, where Disney had no TV show, as a theatrical movie. But this was never developed. Walt then planned to create a feature-length Oz musical with the Mouseketeers. But this never materialized as well, though musical numbers were created and staged for TV as a preview of this project as part of the 4th anniversary of Walt's weekly TV series. A couple of years after that, Walt considered adding the World of Oz directly into his park, based on the popularity of the books and perhaps the popularity of that MGM movie. There were different versions of this attraction or attraction area. One of Rolly's fellow designers, Wethel Rogers, explained that it was to be an extension of Storybook Land, and we went through a number of different attempts at it. Designing the inside of a mountain that at one time was to be a rock candy mountain with all sorts of gumdrops and candy canes. The inside was to be a birthday party for Dorothy from the Land of Oz. The boats would go from Storybook Land in through this mountain and then back out again to the landing area. The best remembered version of this, as Wethel Rogers pointed out, was that big rock candy mountain, a massive structure maybe 5 or 6 stories tall that appeared to be built out of crystal and candy. Designers made concept drawings, and the model department built an actual model of the mountain, using real candy to decorate it. Over the surface of the peaks would run the Casey Jr., though in some drawings it's a different ride system. But the inside of the mountain was a massive show stage, a field in the foreground leading to a party for Dorothy and her friends with the Emerald City in the background. If this had been developed, the stage likely would have used a very early version of audio animatronic figures with limited movement. Perhaps something similar to the side family characters in the Carousel of Progress. The canal boats would float inside the mountain to look at this enormous stage as a tremendous finale for the ride, and then float out the other side where guests would step out of the boats. And this is the project where Rolly started to work directly with Walt in planning and design sessions.
And I actually was in some meetings with Walt about doing the Oz ride, and so he stood up one day, and he loved to act stuff out, and he says, "Okay," he says, "I'm going to be the host of the ride, and you're going to be," what was the name of the gal that was in Oz?
Dorothy.
Dorothy. He says, "Rolly, you're going to be Dorothy." So I said, "What?" He says, "Stand up." So I had to stand up and act it out with him of how you welcome people into the boat and everything, because Walt was like that. He was marvelous. He was just crazier than hell, but it was fun.
Ultimately, nothing like this, other than lovely models complete with fields of flowers made with Rolly's propellers, was ever built for Disneyland. But Rolly was able to adapt some of these scenic designs, including his propellers arranged into a gathering of flowers, for the 1961 Disney film Babes in Toyland, a musical fantasy that picked up some loose ideas from those original Oz projects. Rolly was recruited to work on this film, but also, as he now worked for WED, he was in the wrong union to officially work on feature films at the studio, which caused its own set of troubles.
Yeah, Walt called me in one day. He says he had the director with him, and he said the director wants to do Mary's Garden, and he wants to do something special with it. So he says, I told him, he said, you, Rolly. So, Rolly, I want you to design Mary's Garden. So I did little flower faces. I have some photos of it somewhere in my archives. And their hands were up in the air, and their hands were propellers. And then I did a Mary cockle shell or whatever. So I did a mobile of cockle shells that was in there. And then there was the flowers, the cockle shells, and something else. I forget what it was. And so there was 3 different sets that I did, and I wasn't allowed to work on feature animation. So they told me when I worked in the back lot to hide and do this stuff. They didn't want any of the union people to see me doing this. But, Walt did that. He'd ask you to do something, you just did it. And I remember one time they took the brush out of my hand because they said, there's a union guy coming through here, Rolly. And this is when I was in the paint shop down there.
By the end of 1961, WED was simply outgrowing its welcome at the studio. It was now an issue that Walt's privately owned WED company was being housed entirely at the studio, even though Walt Disney Productions, which owned the studio, was a publicly traded company owned by shareholders. Beyond this, WED now needed more space to develop projects that they wanted to build for the World's Fair. Many key WED designers, including John Hench and Herb Ryman, had offices on the first floor of the animation building directly beneath Walt's third-floor suite of rooms in what was casually known as the WED Wing. Other WED designers were located elsewhere on the lot, though mostly in the animation building. To solve these problems, Walt proposed to move WED off the lot into a building located on Sonora Street in Glendale. But Rolly remained at the studio to work with Yale Gracie on Illusions for the Haunted Mansion. By this point, another designer, Ken Anderson, had already made multiple passes at the Haunted Mansion, which he envisioned as a walkthrough in which a guide led guests through the house room by room. By the early 1960s, as Rolly and Yale expanded these plans, it was still arranged as a walkthrough, but to increase capacity, Rolly and Yale planned the attraction to have 2 identical paths through the house to double the number of guests who could visit the attraction each hour. To use equipment and services at the studio in developing these effects, Rolly and Yale didn't follow the others over to Glendale, at least not initially. They were assigned the back half of one of the second-floor wings in the animation building.
And so Yale and I actually did develop the captain's quarters and did a full-scale mock-up of that on a stage.
On stage 3? Or?
Yeah, I guess it was stage 3.
Okay.
The one where the tank is.
Stage 3.
Yeah, stage 3. And we did a beautiful job on that. But the problem was, did you know the story behind what it was?
Tell me the story behind what it was.
Okay.
During the interview, I was hoping that Rolly would explain the whole story in his own voice, but he instead pushed through to more exciting elements. But let me set this up a little more for you. There were many versions of the Haunted Mansion that were discarded, whose elements are different than the mansion that was built. The version that Yale and Rolly were working on at this time was based around a sea captain who murdered his wife and bricked up her body in the fireplace. Sometime after this, he drowned at sea, but his ghost returned to the house, to the room where the body of his wife still remained. To make this scene on that soundstage, Yale and Rolly created both the figure of the sea captain and also used a skeleton dressed in a silky cape to represent the departed figure of the wife.
what happened was it was Yale's idea about Pepper's Ghost, and there's a whole thing about Pepper's Ghost. And what it was we designed a room, and this was a sea captain's room, and supposedly, the story goes, the way Yale and I kind of portrayed it, was a sea captain would come up out of the ocean, his ghost would come out and appear in his room every now and then, and he'd be dripping with seaweed and water would be coming off of him and everything. So off stage, we built this mannequin that looked like an old sea captain with all this stuff hanging of him, and we put him in a shower.
Let me jump in here for a second. What Rolly is describing is a mock-up of a show stage. Guests would walk in, the lights would dim, and then figures and effects would start to appear on the stage. This sea captain with water dripping off him wasn't actually on the stage. It was just off to the side of the stage, but arranged and lit at the right angle so that in a tall piece of glass at the front of the stage, his semi-transparent reflection would appear to hover through the room. Think of those ghosts in the ballroom scene in the later-built Haunted Mansion. The water that was nozzled onto the sea captain, almost surely this water had something in it so that it was easier to see, perhaps something like milk powder, was sprayed onto the off-stage figure where the liquid was then collected into a basin beneath its feet. But in that on-stage reflection, guests would see the water dripping off the ghostly sea captain's feet and pooling in a half-invisible puddle on the floor.
And we turned the shower on, and then, of course, when you look at the illusion, all you do is see water coming off of him, and the water that went into the pan looked like it was water all over the floor. So we did that, and then we did the fact that he supposedly had murdered his wife, and so therefore she was encased into the fireplace. So he would appear slowly with this water coming out, and then all of a sudden she would appear in the brick of it, and then all of a sudden she would fly out screaming and like this and coming at him, and then they both would disappear. Well, you couldn't do that with a ride, but it would have blown people away to see that. See, we had it as a walkthrough because Walt always wanted it as a walkthrough. So you were on terraces when you went into that little theater, and each room was allowed to be anywhere from 3 to 6 minutes long, depending on the show that you want to put in there. And we also came up with the bringing you the ghost host, bringing him to life right before your eyes, which was something I developed. And so we developed a lot of stuff clear back then.
Did you mock up more than one scene on the sound
No,
stage?
we did. We used all the illusions that we did in that one room.
Mm-hmm.
Like the heads that are like this, and you walk by them, it looks like they're watching you. That was in the room. We had the hole in the floor to where we shot the woman's head up, the ghost with the shroud on her, but it went 20 feet in the air.
So how well did this work? Well, those who saw the Sea Captain stage with all of its effects said it was one of the most impressive combinations of story, illusions, and stage effects that they had ever seen. And then there was that time that Rolly and Yale brought Dick Nunis in to see it. Stern, no-nonsense Dick Nunis, head of Disneyland operations.
We brought Dick Nunis in one time to see it, and it was shot up in the air on 2 wires, but it was compressed air that did it. So we said, Dick, come on over here. And we were walking Dick toward the stairs, and we shot it up and just scared the shit out of Dick. And he says, God, you can't do that. He said, because some lady will see that and she'll die on the spot, you know. So what we did was even Mark's faces that would change. We did all of that on the soundstage.
Wow.
To show Walt what we were doing.
By this time, Rolly was fully part of the WED team, focused on creating new attractions for Walt's Park, with his work in animation fading into the distance behind him. There are more stories here about the mansion, about the World's Fair, about Disneyland. But we'll get to those in a future episode when we return to the life of legendary designer Rolly Crump. I know that the original plan for this week's episode was to explore a unique element of Disney film from the late 1940s, but as Rolly Crump passed away this past week, I wanted to post something that would both honor him as a person and invite listeners to explore his accomplishments and enjoy stories in his own voice. I'll be back next week with a new episode, and at least right now, the plan is to loop back to that episode on the late 1940s. Also, if you're interested in learning more about the early unbuilt designs for the Haunted Mansion, over on Bandcamp you can find 4 episodes that explain the development of the mansion in detail. The 4 episodes are in the series The Long History of Madame Leota. Look for the photo of the California version of the Haunted Mansion on its cover. This series, I should probably point out, is not yet finished, but the plan is to finish it up on Bandcamp this summer. But there's a lot of stories and information already there if you're curious about its history. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions. You can support our efforts by becoming a monthly Bandcamp subscriber. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes. But the best reason to join is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can become a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until then, this is Todd James Pierce.